When was the last time that you said or did something and thought, where did that come from? Or when was the last time you became extremely aware in the moment that you were simply playing a role and not truly being you? Well, today what we're going to do is explore what is going on in these moments by looking at Jung's view of the shadow and of the persona and how they relate to each other. I'll go through the definitions and the development of both of these first and then summarize exactly what the shadow refers to at the end of the video. But as always, just check the timestamps if you're interested in any particular part of this video compared to the rest. Right, so to understand the shadow, we need to understand, first of all, the persona and how these two relate to the ego. So to help illustrate the inner world of a human being in Jung's view, we have to understand that we don't simply have one personality, but instead we have multiple smaller subpersonalities that are in constant tension and communication with each other. So let's put our subject in the frame just to make this clear. And this man is not just one man. He's like me and you. He adapts which characteristics and traits he shows to certain people at specific times and under specific circumstances. Sometimes he doubts himself, sometimes he finds himself acting in a way which even he finds confusing, and sometimes he becomes very aware that he is putting on a performance at work. He knows he is still the same person, but he is aware that he's playing a role, and this is the persona. It is the outward-facing personality that we employ to meet the social world around us. There's nothing wrong with wearing a mask to fit the world, and it's something that we all must do, and generally speaking, we put on a mask for two different reasons. One, to meet the expectations and the demands of society, and to meet the expectations, aims, and ambitions that we have on a personal level. Speaking personally, I don't show exactly the same traits when I'm speaking to my partner compared to friends, compared to co-workers, compared to bosses, compared to strangers on the street, and so on. There's a different intensity and focus to each of these masks according to the expectations that I just mentioned, the demands of society, and my personal aims and ambitions. So before I even introduce the shadow specifically in this video, attention has already appeared. My persona wants me to fit in and to be accepted, to be celebrated, to relate in a meaningful way to the outside world. But the persona is just my outward-facing personality. My wider ego is much bigger than this, and it often wants the opposite. It really wants me to be separate from everyone else and to realize its own uniqueness and for me to become an authentic individual away from society's rules. And this is where shadow becomes relevant. The ego slowly decides over time which traits are desirable for our circumstances and will help us to fit in and adapt to society. But in doing this, it also relegates, suppresses, and represses all those parts of ourselves that don't fit in with society's expectations. And this isn't always a conscious process, and we all do it. So the material that makes up our shadow is the material that is conflicting with the persona, or the conscious ego awareness more generally. But it's not that one is good and the other is bad, but rather they oppose each other. And in this way, they actually complement each other. But that's just not obvious at all at first. So before I expand on that, I just want to explain a little bit more about how the shadow came to develop in the first place. And one of my favourite explanations of this process comes from the poet Robert Bly in his essay, The Long Bag We Drag Behind Us. I'm just going to quote from this just off screen, and I'm going to show what this looks like in terms of diagrams. So, when we were 1 or 2 years old, we had what we might visualize to be a 360-degree personality. Energy radiated out from all parts of our body and all parts of our psyche. A child running is a living globe of energy. We all had that ball of energy. But one day we noticed that our parents didn't like certain parts of that ball. Behind us, we have an invisible bag, and the part of us that our parents don't like, we, to keep our parents' love, put it in the bag. So, this metaphor of bag stuffing is quite a long one in the essay, and it continues through to high school and how we interact with our culture and how we enter the workplace and other similar ideas. All the things that about us that aren't well received by the environment are the things that get stuffed into that bag. But the key point is this: the more we stuff into the bag, the bigger it gets. And the bigger it gets, the heavier it becomes. And the heavier it is, the more energy it takes to lug it around behind us. So rather than focusing on ways to gain more energy, which is itself a tiring process, it's much easier and potentially more rewarding to choose to start taking things out of that bag instead. And this will automatically free up that blocked energy. For those of you that might have seen my shopkeeper analogy video for shadow work, by the way, you might be able to see how some of these are similar metaphors that point towards the same thing. But the main constructive comments and feedback that I got on that video were about understanding what shadow work actually is. So that's why I'm creating this video, to address those questions. But returning to Robert Bly's example, we can diagrammatically show the persona versus the shadow development with these charts. So over time, the wedge, which represents our outward facing personality and who we consciously think we are, gets smaller and smaller according to those traits which are encouraged versus discouraged by our environment and those around us. So by the time we reach our mid-20s, the persona is only a small fraction of the full potential that we could be. And we try to face the world using the tools that we're used to habitually using based on our unique development. It'd be much more valuable to try to reclaim as much of the other 350 degrees of our personality as possible, rather than just focusing on optimizing that 10%. And all those characteristics that were banished away from our conscious awareness, they didn't simply disappear. It's just that the light of our consciousness simply focused elsewhere, leaving those shadowy aspects to lurk in the dark. They'll still be pulling the strings below the surface, except we won't be able to see them operating. So we might reduce their role simply to fate or to project them outwards onto other people. Let's say that anger was forbidden in the family growing up, and I will use this angry bird as an example to help illustrate this. To fit in, any functional persona, and that's the key word here, functional, couldn't be identified with anger because it was at odds with our caregiver's intentions and expectations. So this trait was relegated into the shadows. But sometimes we feel genuinely angry, and for the right reasons. And if we can't see or accept that trait within ourselves, then we'll just see it in other people in the world at large and often judge them quite harshly for showing it. I love the phrasing in Robert Johnson's book, Owning Your Shadow, for this. So on page 17, super short quote, "The more refined our conscious personality, the more shadow we have built up on the other side." In other words, the more you practice, just put this back here. In other words, the more that you practice and make your persona a habitual performance, then the more shadow material is going to be lurking in the background as an opposing force. And that's not all doom and gloom. That is actually great news, because the shadow contains so much transformational power and untapped energy. The person who wasn't allowed to be angry as a child can then find a whole new sense of aliveness and vitality just by tapping into that anger in a mature way as a healthy adult. We can begin to integrate this into our conscious personality and come to realize that it actually wasn't a negative thing at all. It might have been labeled bad by your culture growing up, but as a responsible adult, you're able to relabel that. And that is a part of the process of becoming a more authentic individual. I won't go into the term individuation here, but if you're familiar with that idea, that's where it would fit in. So to become more authentic and to become more individual, we need to become aware of our capacities and our capabilities. It's only those who know what they are capable of in the widest possible sense, and to really know their capacity for such amazing and terrible things, that they can really be said to have any meaningful choice over their actions. You can't control or manage potentials you've got no grasp on. So by making the unconscious contents of the shadow conscious, we gain an element of control over them. And then we become more whole as we do this, and we make it a regular practice. But it's all about balance. We can choose to live our life by our carefully crafted personas for our entire lives, but there will come a point where life starts to feel flat or empty, no matter how outwardly successful it appears to be. And that's where the compensatory and complementary angle of the shadow comes in, by revitalizing life and shaking it up and allowing for this transformation. I've shared this quote before from Romancing the Shadow, but I feel like it's even more appropriate now for this example. So just on page 23, just this short quote here. Whereas the ego weaves together the world, the shadow unravels the world. Whereas the ego acts as a catalyst of creation in the world, the shadow acts as a catalyst of destruction. Whereas the ego supports the status quo, the shadow is an agent of transformation. And we need to learn to move beyond creation equals good and destruction equals bad, and realize the bigger picture of how these two components complement each other for the bigger purpose. Sometimes creation can be a negative hindrance, but sometimes destruction is what is needed for us to move forwards. So to come full circle, this is the ongoing and perpetual dynamic between the persona weaving the world together and imposing order, and the shadow unraveling the world and allowing for change. And as always, I'm always going to encourage you to read these books for yourself so you can see where I'm getting this information. So just a couple to help you out. We've got Owning Your Shadow by Robert Johnson. So that is a very short book, and it's going to give you a super accessible introduction to what shadow work actually is. We've got Romancing the Shadow by Connie, Zweig and Steve Wolfe. I've recommended this book many times before on this channel, and it goes into way more detail than Owning Your Shadow. And it introduces different shadow territories as well, which might be relevant for your situation, such as the family shadow or relationship shadows, friendship shadows, midlife shadows, work-life shadows, and things like that. And then also, I would also like to recommend this third book as well, what's called Integral Life Practice. So if you would prefer a very practical approach to doing shadow work rather than explanation or theory, then this book is going to be great because it is separated into really clear, distinct and overlapping modules, which is based on the shadow, the mind, the body, and the spirit, amongst other ideas. So don't just take my word for it. Please, please, please read these books for yourself. I absolutely love them. And I just want to make this crystal clear now, just at the very end, just what the shadow refers to, bearing in mind that Jung intentionally didn't even offer direct and clear definitions for what this is. So just how light casts a shadow on an object when it is pointed at it, the same thing occurs on a psychological level. The light, our conscious awareness, is focused on who we want and must become, and this illuminates our ego and persona. Naturally, the shadow that trails behind this becomes the shadow, as we've been referring to it here. And the shadow isn't necessarily negative, but might appear that way to our conscious mind. So, for example, if we choose to be patient, ordered, and humble, then the shadow qualities might be those of impatience, spontaneousness, confidence, or arrogance. And notice that there's appropriate times to be ordered, but sometimes that too much order would get in the way. So we need to be able to integrate the spontaneous part of our personality and not just banish it away if we want to become more whole. We often can't see these shadow qualities because they're hidden from what our ego wants us to be able to see. So we can often pick up on these qualities by seeing how we judge others and realizing what puts us in a mood or what makes our bodies feel tense or stressed. And the persona and the shadow complement each other, just like I was saying before. So that means that the more I want to be seen as good and refine this part of my personality, the more potential energy is going to be bound up with the word bad. If I can't accept or acknowledge my own badness or shortcomings, then I will only be able to see them in another person, which sets up a very, very unfair, grandiose versus inferior dynamic. And shadow work might seem like a really confronting experience, but it's very, very life affirming. And in the long run, it's going to lead towards a much, much richer and fulfilling life. And these shadow qualities, they demand our attention and they'll make sure that we pay attention to them in one way or another. So we might as well do this process voluntarily and consciously. Otherwise, we're going to run into some serious trouble down the line. There's actually another incredible idea and structure of the psyche that I rarely see discussed online in any detail called psychosynthesis, but I'm going to save that for another video. It's very, very complementary to the idea of shadow work because it's all based on unconscious material. So if you like this type of idea, then I'll explain the higher, middle, and lower unconscious on a separate video. But I am mindful for the length of this video, so until then, just let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you in a future lesson. See you then.